All right, so today we're going to spend a few minutes working with lists. So the goal of this is to give you an overview of what lists are, how we use them basically, and just to give you some hands-on um, work with lists. So we're going to build on some of the things that we've talked about in previous lessons, but overall, this is just really to give you an overview so you can start going through and having some more practice time with the idea of lists. So when we talk about lists within Python, lists are a collection of arbitrary objects. And the word arbitrary is actually very important there. Because when we talk about lists, it could be lists of various types of objects. It doesn't all have to be strings, or it doesn't have to be just a list of integers. It could be a mixture of strings and integers. It could be strings, integers, and additional lists that are nested in there. As we're going to look at some of the methods around lists, we're actually going to use lists to append to lists. So overall, it could be this arbitrary collection of objects. And as we look at lists, they'll look very familiar to you because they're in square brackets, and then we separate those values with commas. And so we've already seen that before. So we're just going to learn how to create lists and manipulate them a little bit in today's lesson. There's 4 things that I want you to keep in mind about lists. One is that they're ordered. So the order of the items within a list become very important. The other thing is that they contain the same or various types like we talked about. They can be accessed by an index number, which we'll look at, but essentially each object in the list, because it's in a certain order, has an index assigned to it. So we can actually work with the list by its index number and or the name of its value. And then they're immutable, so we can change them. We can make changes to them. So ultimately, as I mentioned before, lists are ordered. So if I have lists with the same elements that are in a different order, they're actually different lists. So you specify the order to get started. We've got here an example of a list called players. Within there, we've got 3 baseball players, Bellinger, Betts, and Smith. So that's one list. If I do the list again and I do a different order of that list, that's now a new list. That's a second list. So the order becomes important. It is mutable, as we mentioned, so we could change the order, but initially, lists with the same elements in different orders are considered different lists. Lists can contain the same or various types. So as we mentioned, it could be a list of strings. So in this case, the names, the last names of baseball players, but we can also do a list where we add another value or data type to it. So in this particular case, we've got strings and numbers, the name of the player and their number. So Betts is 50 and Bellinger is 35. We've got strings and numbers there. So it's okay and quite frequent that you're going to use a variety of objects within a list. Individual elements in the list can be accessed by an index. So as I mentioned, we have Bellinger, Betts, and Smith. That order is important because what that says is at the index, which starts at 0 and not 1 in Python, so we start counting at 0, Bellinger is at index 0, Betts is at index 1, Smith is at index 2. So we can either, again, access the list by the person's name, and we could say player equals Bellinger and find out more about it. Or we can say players 0, which would also be Bellinger because we're accessing it by its index number. We're also going to use pandas. So pandas, as we did last week where we did the read CSV, we pulled in a CSV file to work with data. We can do the same thing here. So what we can say is that we want to take a certain value or column that we pulled in from the data frame within pandas and assign that to a list because we want to work with it. We want to do some searches on it. We want to maneuver it, manipulate it, whatever else. So we're going to use the toList method in order to do that. And we'll do that in just a few minutes because we're going to work with a panda list. And lists are mutable. So as I mentioned, there's going to be methods that we can go and we can append the list, delete from the list, pop from the list, make everything uppercase, we're going to talk about soon. So all of that being said, what we're going to do is we're going to bring in a list into pandas and we're going to manipulate it a little bit within Spider. So let's go ahead and go to Spider and take a look at that. As I've mentioned before, what we want to do when we first look at spiders, especially because a lot of us may have already just kept it open from last time, is we want to do a reset. We want to make sure that there's no values or anything already in there. and then we want to do a clear. We want to start from a clean slate. We can just open up a new project or new file if you'd like to. To me, it's just as easy to just do a reset and clear. So as I mentioned, just from a basic list, if we were to type in a list and assign it to players in this particular case, and what do we say? Bellinger, Betts, and Smith. We can just type in players, and we can see our 3, and then we can use an index to find one. So the second player in this particular case is Betts, and we can get to him with players, and then with the index name 1. We can also add or append. So we can do players.append, and we just use a parentheses for this because we're only able to append one value in this particular case. So we're going to add a pitcher. And so now if we look at our players, we now have 4. There is the idea of an extend. An extend is typically going to be used to add more than one value. So keep in mind that extend, essentially you're really just adding a list. So if we want to add a couple more pitchers, because we've already got 3 batters, we can add 2 pitchers here. And we use extend that way, and if we look at players, then we can see that we've added 2 values, and it's really going to append or extend those to the end. Be very careful that you don't want to use extend to add one string, because what's going to happen is it's actually going to break that string up or that value up into different characters. So if I use players extend, and let's say I want to add another pitcher, Joe Kelly, and I just do it this way, what it's going to do is not add Kelly, it's going to add the characters. So if you look at players here, then it's now added just the characters within Kelly. It's actually separated them. So that's not what we want. So players.append for one value, players.extend, add a list of multiple values. But let's do this a little bit more interesting. So let's pull in a bunch of data from our CSV, and I'm actually going to show you a little bit of a trick that we didn't do last time. Just because we're doing this in REPL, we're not really doing this in a program. So as we mentioned before, we need to import pandas, and we also need path from OS. Sorry, a little ahead of myself. But what we did last time is we actually defined a data directory, and then we used pandas, read CSV, and then we used a join to bring everything together. So we're going to make this a little bit easier. So what we're going to do is we're basically just going to say, we're going to call it fantasy leaders again, because that seemed to work last time. And we're just going to say read CSV. And I actually created a smaller CSV subset 2 that's actually just NOS players. Instead of having to go through and define data directory and doing this join and putting all the folders together, what you can do within Spyder in the interactive Python is you can go to the file that you want to call, and you can actually drag it in here. And it's going to create the path for you. And what's nice about that, especially as we get into the operating systems and users and the name of the user and all these folders and stuff like that, it gets pretty confusing or easy for us to do typos. So this tells us exactly where the file is. So we're actually just pulling in directly an actual file, and we're telling it kind of its absolute path to that file. And I will put a link to this updated smaller subset file so you can use it for this particular exercise. So we're just going to say fantasy leaders equals pd.readcsv, and then we're doing the name of the file here. So if I look at fantasy leaders .head, just to make sure it came in, just like we did last time, should be the first 5 rows, should show us kind of a subset of the columns. Even though all the columns are there, it's just going to show us a couple of them. But what we want to do is we want to create a list, and we're going to use a list from the name column. So what we're going to do here is we're going to say names equals, and we're going to use that to list. So we're going to say fantasy leaders dot name to list. So we're creating a list out of the name column from fantasy leaders. So So if I look at names now, I've got a list of all the players in the NL West, is what we're looking at here. And so now I can use this list just like I did with my players list, but now I have a lot more to work with. So a couple things we've already talked about: append and extend. You can also delete. And a lot of times you can delete a player by a name, or you can delete a player by an index. So what we may want to do is just say, we can say delete names, and let's say we're going to do a -1, so we're actually going to go from the end when we talk about the index. So if we look at names now, we've actually gotten rid of Zach Rex. So that's one way that we can get rid of the last player in a list, for example. So we don't just have to use a positive index, we can actually count back, we can do splits, we can do a lot of things with those index numbers. The other way you can just delete the last name, the easiest way to do it, let's say we want to get rid of Cody Wilson, so we can do what's called a pop. So with pop, if I just say names.pop and I don't put a value in it, then it's going to take by default the last person. Oh, why did I do delete? And it just got rid of Cody Wilson. So that's one way we can do it as well. So we can look at delete, we can look at pop, we can look at append, we can look at extend. We can add multiple players a couple different ways, or delete players a couple different ways with delete and pop. So there's a lot of different methods that you can use. You can also modify. So a lot of times what happens is we're taking in a list of input values and we're doing some comparisons with them. And we want to see if values mix. And sometimes if we're leaving it up to the user to do an input, or even if they've inputted into a CSV file and we didn't clean it up or catch it, you may have different values. So if I look at Joey Bart, for example, and I want to say Joey Bart is equal to Joey Bart, and the person who entered it automatically or accidentally had a typo and capitalized Bart but didn't capitalize Joey or whatever else, and I look at values, they're not going to equal up. So maybe what I want to do is make everything uppercase or lowercase so that everything matches and everything's consistent. And so there I'm actually going to use a for loop for that. And we talked about loops before, but what I can do is I can go through each element within the list and uppercase every element, so that way everything matches, right? I don't have to worry about case. I'll just make everything uppercase and make it simple. So in this particular case, as you can see here, I said names upper, so I'm creating a new list here. That's going to actually be a list of name.upper is the method or the modifier that I'm going to use here, and I'm going to say for name, so name is the element that I'm talking about in my list of names. And so that's another way that we can actually start modifying a list with a little bit more complexity. And so if I hit enter here and I look at names upper, and then everything is uppercase, so it makes it easier to match and to check for equality and stuff like that. So that's just a taste of lists for today. We'll definitely go into more detail in later videos because we're going to use lists an awful lot, especially as we start creating some data visualizations and really working with the data. The last thing to keep in mind is we did not modify the CSV file at all. So what we did is everything's in memory here. So unless I do an output like I did last week where we created a whole new list and we wrote to the file, we're not writing to a file here. So as soon as we clear and reset this session here, all of these changes are gone. So these changes are just in memory. They're not affecting the actual file. So I hope this was helpful in this week's video, and we'll definitely continue using lists in our journey of Python. Thank you.